So picture the scene. You've been to medical school for 5 years, you've worked as a doctor for a number of years, and you're walking on the street and you see someone in the need of medical help. They've been stabbed or they've been hurt. They're crying for attention, but you are so late to meet your in-laws. What can you do in that situation? As a doctor with medical training, do you have a legal obligation to help a person in need? That's what we're going to be talking about in this video. My name is Kiran, I'm a junior doctor and a comedian. On the other end of this, I've got my friend, also called Kiran. He's been demoted from best friend to friend, it seems. My best friend Kiran is a doctor in Australia. Why don't you kick us off? First of all, has this ever happened to you before? Have you ever been in a situation where you've had to help or not help?
I think these types of situations are attracted to healthcare professionals. You have no idea the number of paramedics, nurses, doctors, anybody working in the healthcare profession that they're walking along and there's a commotion and somebody's having a medical emergency. The question is, do you go and help? Under what circumstances should you help? Under what circumstances shouldn't you help? And what legal cover is there for you if you do help? So has this happened to me before? Yeah, it has.
I like that you're asking yourself the questions.
This is just a one-way. This is a one-way interview. You don't get to speak in this one.
So has this happened to you before?
It's a great question that I can ask myself. Has this happened to me before? Yeah, it did. It happened 2 times in the past month, actually. So those are the ones fresh in my mind that I can tell you about. The first one, I was returning from seeing a relative in Canada, and I was on a flight from Vancouver to London. And suddenly, when everyone's trying to sleep, and I was just coming to the end of my movie, just about to try to get to sleep, it says, there's a medical emergency on board. Can any medical professionals please make themselves known to the cabin staff? So you kind of think, oh, yeah, okay, I should go because we're on a plane, and you don't know what it is. So you have a look up and see who else is wandering around and who's actually just going to the toilet and who's walking away from it. Those are probably key things. And then I walked down, I let myself be known to the members of staff. I then told them that I was a doctor, and they guided me to where there was a medical emergency, and there was a lady who was lying on the floor and she looked very pale, and there was 2 other people who stood next to her. So I introduced myself to the patient, and I introduced myself to the 2 other passengers on the flight.
Did you do it like an Oscar station? Hi, my name's Kiran, I'm a 3rd year medical student.
I need to wash my hands. Can I confirm your name and date of birth? No.
I'm sorry, that's not the right date of birth.
Yeah. So what happened was I introduced myself to these other 2 people, and they were a couple. And what actually happened in this was we were lucky. We had a chap there, a husband who was a paramedic. We had myself, who was a doctor who's got most of his training in the emergency department. And then we had an anaesthetist who was a consultant. So we basically had a trauma team there, pre-hospital trauma team, to be able to manage this patient. We were able to then get from the staff on the flight, they brought their medical equipment. So nobody on the flight is fully medically trained. They might be first aid trained and they may be CPR trained, but they weren't fully medically trained. So they handed over the equipment to us and we took a look in it. Things like pulse oximeters, there were cannulas, there's a bag of fluid. These things get checked every so often on the flight to make sure that it's all in date. So we were able to get the vitals for this lady. She had severely low blood pressure, and we were able to fix her as much as we could. We were in communication with some doctors on the ground, and so if the doctors on the ground are technically the ones in charge, but we are the ones with our hands and eyes on the patient, so we communicate about what we think is best and they communicate what they think is best for the patient.
Did anyone do anything heroic?
I thought that I was right at the climax of my film, and I got up to leave it, and I thought that was pretty heroic, to be honest.
So it was that kind of film?
No, it was The Matrix, the new Matrix. It was a good start, terrible end. Sorry for spoilers, everyone.
So the dynamic there is there's an anaesthetist, there's you, there's a paramedic who led things, who was sort of assessing the patient. We sort of trying to do it all together.
Yeah, the paramedic and myself led the assessment, and the anaesthetist, as they do, stand all knowingly at the back, ready to pounce if there's any airway compromise.
Did you have to use anything from their medical box?
So yeah, we used the pulse oximeter, blood pressure. We started her on some oxygen, but it's not that high flow. It's only a couple of litres of oxygen, so there wasn't that much high flow oxygen. And that was all we needed to do at the time because she was communicating with us. And so we were able to move this lady to a better position. We were able to give our recommendations to the staff about what we needed to do. We agreed with the doctors on the ground that this lady was not in an emergency situation enough for us to ground the flight, but we did have a plan in place where we would ourselves go back to check up on her at certain interims to be able to see how she's doing, to be able to take the vital signs, and to see if we still needed to give the oxygen. We moved her forward to business class because then she was able to lie down and have more privacy, and we were able to get grounds.
I see now.
Unfortunately, I wasn't able to stay. I remained in the economy class.
They ask you how you are, you just have to say that you're fine when you're not really fine, but you just can't get into it.
Do you know what? I think it's a real shame you weren't able to stay. If there's spare seats, give the man a seat. So do you know on this landing the plane thing?
Yeah.
It reminds me of a story I got told from my friend Sanchit, who's also a doctor.
Yeah.
And we did another video where we reacted to an episode of Scrubs, and he told me a story of where it happened to him, and they actually had to land the plane. He was like, I'm not happy with this, we need to land the plane.
I mean, you would. So if there were any doubts, you would land the plane because you can, and people getting from A to B is not as important as someone staying alive.
You maybe wouldn't land the plane. You might allow the pilot to do it, unless you're like, I am a doctor, I am the hero, I need to land this plane.
Yeah. And then the important thing at the end was the airlines sign an indemnity form, and it's co-signed by the captain of the flight, so the person who's in charge of the plane, and they'll co-sign alongside you. So you put down your name, you put down your registration number, so your GMC number, and then they have a statement which says, in recognition thereof, the airline declares that in so acting, the healthcare professional will be protected and held harmless by the airline from claims by the patient or anyone claiming on his or her behalf, alleging negligence in the performance of the services provided by the healthcare professional. This indemnification shall not extend to damages caused by the gross negligence or willful misconduct of the healthcare professional.
And so did you get that form before or after you'd helped?
After I'd helped.
Okay, that's really interesting because I've had a medical emergency on a plane and not had a form.
Interesting, okay. What was your situation?
I actually have a whole YouTube video on it, interestingly.
If I was a better friend, I would have watched that.
But I'll briefly summarize it for you here.
Yeah.
I was on a flight with my family to the Caribbean, and about halfway through the flight, they asked if there was any doctors on board or paramedics or anyone healthcare trained. I volunteered myself, went to the front of the plane. There was 4 doctors, an ophthalmologist, a hematologist, a GP, and me. The ophthalmologist and hematologist looked at the situation, said, this isn't something we've done in a very long time, because they were quite old, and they left. The GP and me were left, and it was basically a patient who was having a hypo, but kept on vomiting. The interesting thing was they were getting instruction from the ground, but no one on the plane was allowed to touch that box without speaking to the ground first. And then any of the medications we wanted from that box, I was responsible for getting them. So they were like, we cannot touch the box. So I had to draw up medications, which I've not done since 4th year OSCEs.
Yeah. I remember that one.
To stop this person being sick. I obviously did the history, the examination, did the blood pressure and pulse and all of this stuff. This patient, again, was moved from economy to business class, managed to stabilize them because they were ready to land the plane.
Yeah.
Because they were like, we've already given them lots of glucose. They keep vomiting. We can't keep their blood sugars up. It was 1.8. We managed to do it by stopping them from being sick and also giving them slow-acting carbs and fast-acting carbs. But I never heard from it again. That was it. I gave my name, I gave my number, I gave my email address. It was British Airways. Never heard anything again. No letter about indemnity, no, the patient's okay, no nothing.
I wasn't aware, because I hadn't looked into it, that I needed one or wanted one, an indemnity form. It was actually the airline, it was the head of the cabin crew who was the one who mentioned it first and said, we'll need to fill out these forms. And I said, of course, let's do that.
So I know the answer to this, so I'm going to ask you it. Maybe you know as well.
Yeah, I do. I think I do now.
By law, does a doctor have to help in an emergency?
No. By law, a doctor does not have to. But ethically, they do. And that's where the grey area is.
I think that is, it's a really grey area, but I think that is the correct way for it to be, really.
Yeah.
Can I read you what the MDU say about indemnity in these emergencies?
Yeah, do that.
It says, Although there is no legal obligation to do so, the GMC's guidance state that doctors must offer help in an emergency. So that is so contradictory.
It is.
To say that the law says that you don't have to help in an emergency,
Yeah.
but the GMC, which is the regulatory body
Yeah.
that basically governs doctors, allows them to practice as doctors, says you have to help in an emergency.
Yeah, so you could be protected by law. So if you don't help for any reason, and we'll go into those reasons that you might not want to or be able to, so you are protected by law, but you are not protected for your license to practice. So if for any reason that you don't, then you may not go to jail, so you are protected. You may not be fined, but you could lose your license to practice medicine in the future.
And that's my interpretation of it as well, is that you won't go to jail, but you may lose your license to practice if you haven't helped when you could have done.
I think that's in keeping with the General Medical Council making things as nasty and prickly and difficult for the doctors.
Do you think that puts undue pressures on people who maybe aren't so confident in those situations?
I think
because
so.
Realistically, you've worked in the emergency department for a long time. You're happy handling a sick patient.
Yeah.
As a brand new doctor,
Yeah.
do you think that's putting too much pressure on you, saying you have to help in an emergency?
I think that's a really good point, because the number one thing that you want to do is the oath you take is to do no harm. So that is the number one thing. You, as a doctor, you want to make sure that any interventions or any help you're giving somebody, you are not harming them. The next step is about helping them and improving their situation. But you don't want to do an intervention if you're, let's say, underconfident, you haven't been trained properly to manage those types of situations, or it's been a long time since you have managed those situations and you haven't had recent experience.
That's a really interesting one as well, because let's say the haematologist and ophthalmologist in my scenario, quite elderly people.
Yeah.
How often has this haematologist encountered an acute hypoglycemia in a vomiting patient in the past 20, 30 years? Probably never.
Yeah, not many.
And although she still has a medical degree, she will have been taught all of these things, she'll be expected to know these things.
Yeah.
You know, what would she have done in that situation?
Exactly, because she'll have super specialized knowledge about her field. She'll be incredibly competent and skilled within her field, and may have some within relevant crossover fields, but this is a completely different spectrum to what people normally encounter. You've got the same in terms of if people are retired. So if there's no, let's say you're on a flight again and there's no other healthcare professional there and you're a retired GP or a retired doctor, well, you've relinquished your license to practice. So you no longer are trained to a standard and are expected to keep your skills up because you've relinquished your license. Should you be asked to go to practice? I think that's a pretty interesting question. I'm pretty sure you're covered. You have to say, I think you're encouraged to say that if you are going to go and help, that I am retired, but would you still like me to help you? And if the patient consents, then I think that goes a long way to helping the situation.
What if the patient can't consent? What if the patient's drowsy? I guess you have to act in their best interest, but it's so difficult, isn't it? Because imagine this, that the retired GP who's been retired for 10 years, but it still, feels like he's capable, says, I'm a retired GP, can I help? The cabin crew don't know otherwise, say, yes, please help. And something goes wrong, that's falling on that person. I have a gut instinct that person will be thrown under the bus. To say, retired, not up-to-date doctor has done this and some harm has come as a result of it.
Yeah, I think you're right. The next situation that is an interesting one to talk about, which I think is really relevant, is if you've had anything to drink, so if you've had any alcohol. The question is, should you go and help then? Because you wouldn't be allowed to go into work to practice medicine normally if you'd had anything to drink. So if you're outside of that situation, should you go and help or not? And at what level should you, and are you protected? That's, again, it's not really
interesting.
It's not really being dictated. What do you think?
My gut feeling of that is no. But the flip side to that is that a doctor who's had one half glass of wine is still more capable at looking after a person than a lay person that's had nothing to drink.
Or nobody at all. If there was no one else except you there, but you'd had a glass of wine or a beer, are you going to be better? And I suppose that's a really difficult situation. I think again the same scenario occurs in terms of consent. If the patient can verbally consent, or family and friends of them can consent on the behalf of the patient, then you can ask and say, I'm a doctor, I have had a drink tonight, you can tell them how much, would you like me to help you or not? And I think it's at that point, it's your decision as to whether you go over, and then you should, if you are going to go over, you should try and get consent. I do believe that is protected now. I think the Good Samaritan Act is protected under law from a UK Act in 2015, which has made things a bit more binding and protective for people that are trying to help in these situations, because you really don't want to put yourself out there, risk your career, your family, your livelihood with situations and not be protected by the law when you're trying to do good. And I think most people agree with that.
So on that, it says that the risk to doctors being sued after they've helped in an emergency is very low. The Social Action Responsibility and Heroism Act of 2015 helps to protect those acting in an emergency in England and Wales from legal action. This act states that when a court considers a negligence claim or breach of duty, it must consider whether the person was acting for the benefit of society or any of its members, or whether a person demonstrated a predominantly responsible approach towards protecting the safety or interests of others, or the person was acting heroically by intervening in an emergency to assist an individual in danger. So basically, there is some legal protection if it's an emergency, but I feel like it's not clear cut. It's not black and white.
No, it's not. And I think it's to cover the rare events. In my experiences, and there've been a few times when I've needed to do these Good Samaritan Acts when I'm not on shift, and people have been so thankful that there is someone there, and particularly the people, it's more the bystanders, it takes the stress off them, because people think, oh, I need to help, but actually don't know how to help, and that's really stressful for people near the situation, who's witnessed the situation. So having somebody there who has been trained does help to alleviate a lot of the stress, and also pick the right management and assessment of patients. Most of them I've encountered, all actually that I've encountered in these situations, have been really thankful for me coming here to help.
100%. I agree with that. And the video that I made about it was it was a bit of a story time, really, to say, look, this situation happened on the plane. But then I had so many messages on Instagram and TikTok from people saying, my son is a type 1 diabetic, my sister's a type 1 diabetic. What you've done, I would be so grateful for that. Thank you so much. And the patient at the time on the plane was, even though being really sick, so grateful for what had happened. I felt to mitigate risk for myself on the plane, one of the things that I did is made sure that anything I was doing, I was double checking with other people. I'm planning on doing this. How do you feel about that? To one of the nurses, to one of the cabin crew who was an ex-nurse, to the other GP. I think we should give this. How do you feel about that? Everyone's in agreement. It's not you being a hero. We all decided that it was the best thing to do. We all checked the medication. We all checked the dose. We all watched me draw it up.
It was very much a team. It's very much a team effort to be able to help someone. And obviously you all agree, and particularly agree with the patient, that this is the best course of action.
Exactly. And I guess that's the bottom line of it, is asking the patient, if you can speak to them, or what do you want to happen? Nice, great video. Really interesting chat there on do doctors have to help in emergencies. If you enjoy this sort of thing, follow my life as a junior doctor and a comedian in the UK. We make all sorts of videos. Make sure you subscribe. The button should be around here. Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.